Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and this is the Ultraviolet Podcast. And today I am joined by Dr. Mansa Keita. Mansa is a computer scientist by training, and he is also a Rastafarian. And that is what we spend the majority of the interview talking about, is his faith and the ins and outs of the Rastafari religion and social movement and what it means to him and how he came to be an adherent to it. And then the conversation moves more into the realm of modern social justice discourse. We talk about Mansa's online opposition to sort of reactionary elements in our world, pseudo-academics who are pushing race realism. And he's hit on a very effective strategy for combating these folks and pointing out just how ridiculous a lot of their positions are regarding race and IQ and race realism and all of this other nonsense. We talk about that and effective strategies for combating right-wing rhetoric, particularly as we move towards a world where that is becoming more and more commonplace within the mainstream. Overall, it was a really fun and interesting conversation, and I was really glad to get Mansa on, especially knowing that he's presently recovering from an illness. So I was really, really thankful that he was able to fit me in, and I appreciate his time very much. And I will not keep you from that conversation any longer. So without any further delay, I give you Dr. Mansa Keita. Mansa, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. How are you doing this morning?
It's kind of, I'm tired. I could feel the tiredness kicking in and everything. But I'm here. So I went through COVID, I think just now, and it has its effect. This time it actually really hit me. So, but I'm okay. I think I'm fine now.
Oh, this is you've had it more than once.
It's been through our house. So I think the first one came through our house, and that one didn't do anything to me. It really got my wife though. And then this time, I think I got hit first, and it like I haven't been knocked out like that for a bit, so it's kind of interesting.
Well, I'm glad you're feeling better, and I do appreciate you joining me. So we came to this interview kind of in a is just sort of a scattershot way. You posted on Twitter that you don't regularly talk about your faith. And if anybody had any questions, you'd be happy to answer. And I kind of bum rushed you and was like, actually, I would love to just have you on the show to talk about it because I've been following you for a little while on Twitter. I really like the way that you engage with the sort of race realist assholes that were our favorite punching bag of the circles that we travel in. But I am actually very curious about the Rastafari faith. I've never really delved into it, and I've been getting more into reading and learning about Pan African thought, and it seemed like a really good opportunity to get you on the show to talk about it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, well, it's not something I do talk about much. It is just something that's there. Like I went through um, thinking about it when I was young, getting into it. Um, so as we'd say, like recognizing it and then just living it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the interesting things about it is there's both structure but not.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no like central organization that controls dogma or anything like that. There's no the equivalent of a church in a sense, even though so Rasta has, I would say, like three main mansions, we'd call them,
Mm-hmm.
which are like groups, right? So uh, the 12 tribes of Israel is one group, the Bobo Shanti is one group, the Naibingi is one group. There are others, right? But at the end of the day, pretty much for each person, you get to sort of realize your own journey,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, yeah. So
So That is when I was looking over just sort of stuff to prep for the interview, it did strike me that it is very much of a it's not a heavily centralized or structured religion like you said, that it is very it seems very much like a kind of a personal journey more than it is a central structured religion. Would that be fair to
Yep,
say? Or
yep, nope, absolutely.
yeah. So how did
Because
you I'm sorry, go ahead.
because there's some central philosophies that make even there's some core philosophies that make a centralized structure not
Mm,
logical even.
mhm,
Um, I think pretty much the core or one of the core philosophies is I and I,
mhm,
um, which is oneness. It's the oneness with creation, the oneness with the Almighty. And a lot of the other groups, you'll hear them talk about things, but they're pretty much all derived from this idea um, that I remember man is made in the image of God, and we actually took that right. So we are, if we live a certain way, we are the reflections of God on earth, right?
mhm,
Um, but then if you are yourself the reflection of God on earth, if you're living in a godly way, then it wouldn't really make sense for you to have to defer to another person to tell you the right way to live, right?
mhm.
It's like, who would God defer to if God was here,
Right.
right?
It does it, so that actually the concept of I and I was something that, kinda jumped out to me. Um, does that specifically refer to a when you say a oneness with God, does that is it sort of a at bottom, like a pantheistic belief structure where each individual person and thing is an aspect or facet of God. So, like the phrase I and I would be like I, the individual, and I, the God as well, in one, or is it something different than that?
I don't think of it as like a facet of
Hmm.
God. It's just wow. It's so I guess there would have to be like a deep philosophy underneath the whole thing. But even the idea of it to me, it's um, I think it's the concept of that oneness itself, and then
Hmm.
just that we're a part of it. So it's not like all together we form a God or something like that. It's just that God exists, and
Hmm.
um, we are connected to that. So it's not a, and I don't even, I know for some it's very different. Like I don't view God existing as, here is a mass or a body or like a, whatever you want to use, and that's God. Like that to me doesn't even really make sense. Um, Even my concept of God. So the thing with Rasta as well, though, it's because it's not centralized. What people end up with, what they mean by God, is often very different from another person. And I've said my version. I've actually even leaked it on Twitter a bit, and not
Hmm.
a lot of people love it. Some of the philosophers didn't really like the idea.
Oh,
Um,
by all means, go ahead with it.
so
I
for
would,
me, okay, so I guess I'd have to give some background.
sure, yeah,
So for background, I come from a very evangelical
okay.
family and background. So me myself was heavy duty into the church, champion Bible quizzer and everything like that.
What specific like denomination, like Southern Baptist or
Pentecostal,
Pentecostal? Okay.
hardcore Pentecostal, yeah. Um, and like I eventually left that.
Hmm.
I left it pretty much because I was too into it. Why I left it, I found too many things I wasn't that didn't work for me from the theology point of view.
Okay.
Um, but then when I decided to go back to religion, if you will, decided I went through a phase of my life where I just wanted to figure out where I stood, and I actually went at it from sort of a reset,
Hmm.
and the reset was trying to get in tune with my own morality, my own views on sort of everything on life. And it was funny because while doing this, or later in the process, when I realized that's sort of how the history of Rastafari itself was. Um, a big reset, as in like, you know what, the church has lied to us. Let's just wipe it and do it all ourselves. And
Mhm.
what they did is they took the Bible, because that was still their foundation. They said, let's give the Bible our own reading, independent of that,
Mhm.
of the church's influence. So for me, with the concept of God, I was just thinking, like, what is God? Like, what would I say God is? And I realized, like, you have all these major religions in the world, and each of them will say God is like this, God is like that, God is like, whatever. And what I thought to myself is, okay, really all we're seeing are different lenses, right? Each group, each person comes up with their own lens, and they're looking through these lens at, something. Um,
Mhm.
and I think I came up with this, and at one point I'm like, you know what? I think the thing that we're all searching for, right,
Mhm.
is itself God.
Mhm.
Now this is it's weird. So it's not necessarily that there's a being there. It is whatever it is that we're all reaching towards, and we all find ourselves pulling this lens towards.
Mhm.
That is what I'm going to call God. And realistically, now I'm thinking about it. I don't care what that thing is. Like, I don't care if there's a there. It's
Mhm.
that the fact that we're reaching means that there's something we're striving for. And I just want to acknowledge that thing is important to me. And that connection that we all share of reaching towards this thing, right? And different people will come up with whatever they want for it. Like, honestly, even, the humanists who just say, like, oh, we're all humans and we're all connected by equally being human. That's cool with me too, right? Because
Mhm.
at the end of the day, I come back, my key goal is then we're all connected. So if you come up with that connection through something else, I'm okay with that. If then our whole goal is, you know, we have to look out for each other, and in some way we're responsible for each other, I'm okay with that. That oneness, or that striving for oneness, or that striving for connection, that to me is actually God.
Hmm. Do you think that is it just the striving and sort of the yearning and the questing itself, or is it because there are, and I'd probably have a hard time naming them off the top of my head, but I know that there are impulses in humanity where people appear to strive and yearn towards things with the same similar like religious fervor that we might describe somebody striving towards uh, God or a religious edict, or like a humanist like myself striving towards some sort of like moral equality with people.
Mhm.
But there are other people who would strive towards something very different, for like their own selfish ends. And do you differentiate between those two? Is it the striving itself, or is it striving towards some
It's
vague
yeah,
structure of like
it's the
moral equality?
I shouldn't have said it's the striving itself. I think the way I simplified it was, to me, the concept of God is God,
Okay.
right? Like, so so we're all reaching to that concept. Okay, so the concept is God, and I don't know what's behind that concept, whatever.
Mm.
But I'm just going to leave it as the concept of God is God. So therefore, it allows me to, in essence, recognize everybody who reaches for it, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
Because that way we're saying, okay, we're reaching for the same it, even though we don't see that we're reaching for the same it. So it gives me like this
Okay.
monotheistic view that there
Yeah,
is
that
an it
so
there
you
without.
you came to that from that's a very big shift from Pentecostalism.
Oh yeah, that one was a. So actually, even that one became very political for me, because I rejected, honestly. So I ended up, as I said, I knew that I read and studied the Bible a lot when I was younger. I ended up rejecting the God of the Bible,
Mhm.
which I have some very like biblical friends right now still. So, but what I did is the way I ended up rejecting it was kind of interesting for me, because as I was going through and reviewing and thinking it through, I decided the morality of the God of the Bible was actually too immoral.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the one that drove the nail in the coffin was, I forgot what the name of the tribe was, but when the God of the Bible ordered the genocide of a tribe of people because 400 years previously their ancestors um, were raiding the Jewish people as they were crossing the desert,
Yeah.
and babies, and like ordered the killing of men, women, children, babies, animals too, if I remember correctly, just everything.
Yeah. I can't
And I
remember the name
thought
of the
that
city, but it
was,
was, yeah, they just, I think, like salted the earth too. Like it was bad.
yeah, and I thought that was no. And I just couldn't get over that mentally because I'm like, those are innocent people in my view. And that kind of, there's no justice there. So that to me was sort of evil. And at that point, I'm like, nope. So I didn't believe that had to be, that couldn't be the real full view. So again, I'm
Hmm.
not going to deny that we're all still talking about the same it. Um, but I think if anything, as I matured, maybe as I got older, I looked at it as not rejecting necessarily uh, God in like a Christian sense, but like the God as portrayed in the Bible. So the portrayal of God in the Bible there, I just wasn't cool with that portrayal. So that lens couldn't be my lens.
Yeah. I have a very dim view of
Mm,
the God of Abraham as portrayed in the Bible. I've gotten a little softer in that stance as I've aged, and I've met people who are involved in like liberation theology and stuff. But
mm,
my straight view on a reading of the Old Testament is that it's, if you actually just, and not even like in an edgy like Reddit atheist way, but like if you just read that text, the deity at the center of it very much seems like a demon that
mm.
won.
Well, there's a verse I can't remember where. Um, Maybe it's the King James Version translation where it said, "I created evil," or "I create." Yeah, God says, "I create evil." Um, Anyways, I think what I came out of it. So, like, as I continued my journey and I became more Rasta, the Rasta view of the Bible is it's not literal.
Mhm.
And so it was all very much for Rastas to read the Bible and pick out, sort of use it as a guide, but not a rule book. So pick out what's interesting, pick out what's good, pick out what you think might influence you to be better, but not to essentially worship it as literal. And that was a big change for me as a Pentecostal, where every single verse was supposed to stand on its own.
Mhm.
So so yeah, that was a big change. So I guess as I got older, I could look at stories like that and say, okay, well, yeah, that's just a story. Like like yeah, that's not a true reflection of much of anything.
Yeah, and I think many of the stories in the Bible do play out as reasonable morality tales. Some of them don't play
Hmm.
out. I think the central lesson of many of them is not something that we would think is good or correct in the modern world, but there are good things to be learned from the Bible as there are any. I think
Yep.
you can, yeah, you can
And that's
pick from it.
why
Yeah.
when I was saying like it's a lens approach, um, then that actually helps because I could look at the Bible and say, okay, let me see what good things are here to make me a better person. And I could look at the Quran and say, like, what things are here that could make me a better person. I could look at the Rig Veda and say, what good things are here that can make me a better person. I think I read the Guru Granth Sahib, which I think is the Sikh holy book,
Mhm.
and say, like, what things here could make me a better person, right? So it by opening that up to saying it's just a lens, right? I could look and see what other people around the world have seen through their lens, and how does that make me a better person? And I think Rasta. So I would say from Rasta, right? Other than like I and I being core, other things are essentially the golden rule, right? So love God, love yourself, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then above that is it's everything should be derived essentially from that stuff, right? So you grab the information from where you can find it and bring it together, as long as you're staying true to things like that.
Yeah. Do you? So it seems like there's a couple of different um, paths with the Rasta faith that I, at least from what I saw, where there's what you've described, which seems to be more of a, like, not quite a literalist interpretation and sort of a self-assembling of spiritual toolkit. And then there is more of a, a, a stripe of not quite biblical literalism, but
Yes.
there's some so there are some truth claims about history and things that
Oh yeah, that part is
yeah,
interesting. Yeah, tell me
yeah.
which part you're referring to, because there's a lot of.
So so the two that jump out to me are specifically uh, the divinity of Haile Selassie, and then the claim that the original ancient Israelites of the Bible were Black Africans. Um,
Oh, okay. So let's go to that second one first.
okay.
Yeah, which group is that? Because
I didn't write that down.
okay, that bothers me generally.
Hmm.
Like yeah, that just bothers me genuinely. I wouldn't say that's even like an actual Rasta group belief, because I don't know
Okay.
any group that really holds to that. I do know like some
Yeah.
people
I
sort
just
of.
pulled that off Wikipedia. So that's
Okay,
yeah,
yeah, I
that's not
read
a
the wiki article. I wasn't a huge fan because it kind
okay.
of put some of the views as way more strident than I think any of even the mansions would say that they hold to. Like, yeah, there's always going to be somebody who believes X, Y, Z.
Okay.
Um, like I know the most we call churchical um, of all the mansions are the Bobo Ashanti.
Okay.
Um, and I don't think they really stick to that. And I think like even the 12 tribes of Israel mansion, they name themselves the 12 tribes of Israel, but I don't think it's from a perspective of really that.
Yeah.
Um,
And I know that they're uh there's Ethiopian Jews who are
the
or
Ethiopian Orthodox, yeah,
who do
is
have
another.
like a reasonable claim to some descendancy from the tribes of Israel. So like
So
that's not a completely outlandish claim
that
on its
is a
own.
that it's universal that Rastas will say like Haile Selassie is descended from the Queen of Sheba. Like
Okay.
every Rasta will say that. The Ethiopian monarchy used to say that. So I really of all the claims, I don't think that's a. I don't even personally care if it's true. It's such a meaningless thing. It's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool. Like yeah.
Uh,
Um, but
so the
on
Wikipedia
Haile,
article is not great, is what you're saying.
no,
Okay.
I've read it and I actually I'm like, man, I hope no one reads this and think this is what Rastas believe. It was bad.
Okay.
Yeah, it just made too many things look way stricter than any Rasta would tell you. Because if you actually talk to them, you might hear some people who are like hardcore. Because I do know
Hmm.
hardcore people, and I know some people who are like, well, okay, like settle down. Um, yeah, it's we're not really that strict on many things, and I think on that one they've made like think I remember the race stuff in that was way more aggressive than anything would think is real from the people I see and know. Um, but because like I remember like I'd quote people like Selassie on race, right?
Hmm.
And so it'd be very weird for any person to be a Rasta, um, follow Selassie, and at the same time be like super like I know we Garvey was Pan African, right?
Hmm.
So it was and I guess he was a black nationalist, which has different connotations than people would be accustomed to.
Right.
Uh, but at the same time, it's very hard to think of it in terms of like an exclusionary way. Like it very obviously is the case that white like there can be white rastas or something, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know.
The one thing that jumped out to me about the Wikipedia article that like I kind of gave it some side eye and was there's this paragraph in here where they were talking about how not just black nationalism but black supremacy is a stripe of Rastafarianism, and I was like that
It
I'm not
is.
it is
No, and it's the weirdest thing because I remember when I was young, it doesn't mean okay. So this is a thing to get very accustomed to, especially when dealing with Rastas. A
okay.
lot of what people are accustomed to, especially from like an American lens, has a very different meaning from a Rastafari lens. And so
Okay.
I've often actually talked to people online when people was like back during like the CRT debates and stuff. where people would bring stuff up and say, "Oh, you believe this, and that because of CRT." And I have to remind people that I'm a Rasta. Like our tradition is very different. So like the UNIA, which people might be used to, was a Garvey Foundation, right?
Hmm.
Um, but like all of these traditions are very different. So like we come to sometimes similar conclusions on things, but the intellectual traditions are very different. So the black supremacy thing, right? That is a
Hmm.
Bobo Ashanti standing. And you know what they back it with? It's the most, I'm not going to say ridiculous. It's different.
Okay.
It's followed up with the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Hmm.
So for them, black supremacy really just means loving themselves
Hmm.
and declaring their full humanity
Hmm.
and right to self determination. And the self determination was in a Jamaican context. So
Hmm.
it's like
That. Yeah.
the idea of like black supremacy is like what I would like if you were to hear it from not being familiar with them and their history, you'd think, oh, they want to, they think they should rule over somebody. But there's no concept of ruling among the Bubbles, right? Like they live in a commune. There are actually white Bubbles at the commune because I visited there before,
Hmm.
and at least there was when I went there. Um, and I've met white Bubbles. Like it doesn't. I don't see how. If anything, they're probably one of the most welcoming. So I don't get like, but I do know like Prince Emmanuel, who was the founder. He did use the term,
Hmm.
um, but it has no real connection to anything any normal person would think about as supremacy.
So like that is something that I think is important to keep in mind when we're talking about this or any other um, like Pan Africanist view, and like when we talk about like Black nationalism or even Black separatism, like we've talked about that on my show before with other people about how those things aren't necessarily what most people think they are, and that they're born out of a response to colonialism, and that you know that they bear further consideration than just being written off because of a
Yeah,
word. So like what you're describing now, when I hear you say, is I can see why somebody or a group of people who are emerging from the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and are trying to reclaim their identities would use supremacy in a sense of self supremacy over the conditions of that they're emerging from, rather than necessarily supremacy over any other individual group of people. Is that more kind of what the vibe is?
yeah, and yeah, you're right, and especially when you tie it into how the others are,
Hmm.
like black nationalism and stuff like that. That's exactly it. It's one of the weirdest things because like I do know there's no Rasta groups that believe in supremacy in like the traditional sense of
Hmm.
being above people, and that would be a very weird thing for any Rasta to think. Um, but a lot of the historical black slogans, um, they did sound militant because, like for example, the Bobos will say like black militancy is definitely something they're about, and when you were to ask them what they mean, the descriptions would be kind of anodyne, right?
Yeah.
Like even back in the day when people would talk about black power, and I mean
Hmm.
like the real people, not today's like caricature of it, and you would ask like Kwame Ture, like what does
Hmm.
black power mean, and it would be something like, oh, like it means that we love ourselves and we stand up for ourselves and we want to build our community that we're no longer like held back, and it's like, oh, so that's your power. Like that's
Yeah.
the like it's not scary. Like I don't think anybody would be quaking in their boots when they hear the description. But then if you were to just throw the term at somebody who's never heard it before, it sounds very terrifying. And we have this weird thing where you know a lot of terms that were at some point developed in history, when we look at them today, we're like, oh man, that, they really could have used the marketing department, and just now like there's nothing you could do about it, so you end up having like academics or whatever that when somebody's like, well, what about this scary term, they're like, oh, it means nothing like that, it means like this tiny little thing, and someone's like, "Oh, why don't you change the name?" You're like, "Well, that's kind of hard to do because it's history."
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think when you look back on it, right, like the militantly claiming your own equality within a culture that doesn't value you as an equal person is
Mhm.
you're going to develop some inflammatory rhetoric, right?
Oh yeah,
Like demanding that your humanity be recognized is very rarely a civil affair. You know, it's
this is true.
yeah.
This
So
is true.
like, it's not surprising to me that the conflicts born out of the colonialism, slavery, segregation, any of those things would generate terms and concepts of empowerment uh, and self actualization that can seem, pretty corrosive in hindsight. But in reality, that wasn't really what that was about. It was just people trying to be human beings on a level playing field with other people who did not largely want that to happen.
Right. And I'll be fair to so like Rastafari wasn't. It is weird, but it wasn't quite a political movement. Um, we did have some intersections with political movements where Rastas sort of got involved, especially on the
Mm,
continent, back on Africa. But it was more a social movement, but an individual social movement almost.
mm,
Um, so it was just about it kind of flipped it, right? So as you said, it was is rejecting the idea of uh, inferiority almost uh, outright, just complete rejection, um, and rejecting sort of the propaganda that's driven us there,
mhm,
um, and then just now how do we build ourselves up? And that building ourselves up goes multiple ways because, as I said, Garvey is one of the figureheads, right? So
mm,
it's building ourselves up individually, community, and yeah, for a lot of them, racially, right?
mm,
Um, so you will hear a lot of talk about the black race in um, how Rastas generally talk. It's been different for me, I guess, over the years, but that was like a core thing. Um, because they would view themselves as like, how do we uplift ourselves out of this, right? And even then, like honestly, I don't take the view that it's all the same. So even though I've moved a good bit away from the coherent race concept, even
mhm,
I don't look at it in the same light because at the end of the day, what are they fighting for? Is like we need to uplift this group so that this group is no longer subordinated. Okay, so like even if philosophically I might think the concept of like a black race isn't all that coherent, what they're fighting for is still a good thing in my view, right? So
mm.
they're
Yeah.
still we're still like hydrants as the term would go. Um, but so I don't mind that my own personal philosophy is different than theirs on that.
Mm. Do you have you come to view like the conception of a unified black race as incoherent, or is that something
Oh,
that's like sort of
I find all of them incoherent. So it's I've talked to this because I do yeah, I'm not going to pretend like I do believe race is very much socially real.
yeah.
Um, but I always think that's localized. I don't think like there's inherently anything in common between like a Nigerian, a Jamaican, and an American.
Mm,
Um, that's kind of silly. And I think generally, I'll say the only thing that I think makes black, like quote unquote, coherent, is anti-black racism.
mm,
So it's the racism that says there's something wrong with the people that are black. That is the only thing that makes black somewhat coherent. So, like I've said, you know, when a person in London, UK, talks about how they're treated, right, due to
mm,
be or like quote unquote due to being black, I can relate to that because I can relate to that kind of treatment. Somebody in Chicago might be able to relate to it. And well, I guess I actually can't picture someone in Nigeria necessarily being able to relate to that because it's a different experience, anyways. Um,
Hmm.
so even that's something that makes it less coherent to me because a lot of the experiences that us in, say, the New World, the racism that we experience, it's sort of foreign to somebody, a lot of people, not everyone, in Africa, right?
Hmm.
So how is it, like, by what logic really, um, is my experiences and a person in the Congo tied together? Like, it doesn't make sense. So it's not. That's what I mean. It's not coherent, right? Or I'll use the
Hmm.
same for white, right? Like, somebody in what's a country I could pick here? Bosnia, right?
Hmm.
Like, what exactly is in common between somebody in Bosnia and somebody in Ann Arbor, Michigan, right? Like like what and people will, like, so I think the only thing people appeal to, is genetics, but if anyone's followed along with how, like, human genetics have been progressing, especially over the last 2 decades, it's not even coherent that way, right?
Yeah.
So, especially, and I think the biggest one that kind of blew the whole racialist concept apart was actually Africa, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's so much diversity that it becomes ridiculously illogical, even in Nigeria, right? To pull like two random Nigerians and say, like, oh yeah, you guys are very much the same, when genetically speaking, those two Nigerians might be farther apart than, someone in Italy and someone in England, right? So, or actually, what is it? I remember a thing saying, what, two random Africans um, are more likely farther apart genetically than a British person and someone in China,
Yeah.
right? So, like, the whole concepts don't make sense in sort of any real way. But they have utility locally, right? Like, I
Hmm.
know if someone's talking about black in the US, you know what they're talking about. Like, we could flip it and say, okay, you're referring to African American, you might be referring to ADOS, like a American descendant of slaves, right? I find even the terms to be flipped and used as people need them to be, but sure.
Yeah. I think to maybe throw like a defense towards the Pan Africanist and like Black nationalist conception of race, I would say that the 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 common unifying factor, like you said, is anti-Black racism, but I think it probably would extend to not just anti-Black racism, but specifically the whether or not you are grouped in a social category that establishes you as a precondition to be allowed to be victimized by colonialism, specifically European settler, or well, not necessarily settler colonialism, but like just European colonialism. So somebody in the Congo has in common with somebody from Missouri that they have both been in some way negatively impacted by the structures of European capitalism, which is largely a superstructure for the, well, whiteness, basically.
Right. But while that's true, that would also apply to the person in Vietnam,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
for
So
sure.
then, do we put that person under the same umbrella? That's what I mean. Like, yeah, we could all have an umbrella of, like, okay, you've been screwed over by imperialism, colonialism, whatever, but then that doesn't then create a meaningful racial group of any sort, right? So, like, I get being anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, I get that. I just don't think it creates like a meaningful category of grouping people together. It creates a political action
Hmm.
front that makes perfect sense to me. It just doesn't make sense to then, because I don't even think the colonialists or the imperialists, they weren't grouping everyone and saying, okay, this is us, and everybody else that we're going to take over is now in one group. They were still creating these groups. They were doing it based on what they thought were scientific grounds, um, and then going at these groups to do whatever. But they were just going after everybody that was outside, essentially outside of Europe. And if any of the other Europeans would have been weak enough for them to, or had resources enough for them to find reasons to subjugate them the same, they would have. And actually, I should be fair, because Ireland got royally screwed over in this whole
Hmm.
thing, right? Because I don't even know why. I don't think the potatoes were the main reasons, but for some reason, the Brits, for example, really went at the Irish, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think. I think sometimes we put too much weight on the philosophy that drove the bad stuff,
Hmm.
um, as opposed to like the bad stuff made sense for some bad people. And I don't think those who were affected by the bad stuff necessarily have grounds to say like, okay, because we were affected, we're one, or
Hmm.
that oneness makes sense. Um, but we could all say like, because we're affected, that is itself something to act upon, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sympathetic to that view. I don't really have too much of a personal dog in the fight one way or the other, but you know, I'm of the mind that we should be resisting any of the bad things anywhere we find them.
yeah,
And
I'm with you.
if one group of people, if their vehicle with which they drive their resistance to the bad things is um, like that sort of black nationalist thinking, then I'm perfectly okay with that because at the end of the day, for the most part, that's going to lead them to action that is productive in taking out the bad thing, right?
100% agree.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I don't need to agree with. And honestly, if I did need to agree with everything everyone thought, I couldn't be a Rasta because Rastas believe a lot of very different things. Some of them I really oppose.
Oh,
Um,
maybe we can get into some of those.
sure, but like at the end of the day, you look at the objective and the
Yeah.
harm or whatnot, right?
Yeah,
You
I take a pretty consequentialist view to my like
same.
social
Yep, same
field
here.
philosophy. Like my goal is for everybody to have everything they need and want for nothing and be happy and healthy and whatever it takes to get you there, I'm happy with it. Be it, liberation theology, be it black nationalism, be it secular humanism, like pick a thing, just as long as you show up to the march.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
So
So,
what are some things with Rastafarianism that you like are not a fan of that you object to? Like
oof. So okay. So when I was younger, and this was one of the big ones, even before I got. So when I was figuring out where I was going to end up, um, was homosexuality.
mm,
And I remember when I was younger, and I was like, well, what do I think about gay people? And this sounds like an interesting question, but you kind of have to ask yourself this, especially given my background, right? So
mm,
me telling people I grew up evangelical pretty much means everyone can understand that I grew up viewing homosexuality very negatively. Um, but as an adult, when I was figuring out who I was like, I had to ask myself that. What about that? So if I'm going to religion, do I go back in thinking like this is bad? And it's funny because when I saw my core value and it was love, right?
mm,
And even as a Rasta, like love is supposed to be central to Rasta. And I said, well, if love is key and love is core, how can I refuse to love somebody for who they are? Right.
mm-hmm,
And I said, then I must, if I believe that people are gay, um, because it's just who they are, not because they've made a decision to be, to tick off God, if you will, then it would be logical for any sort of God to make people a certain way in any way, even just to influence them being that way, and then require me to hate them for it. Like that doesn't make sense. So I said, if I'm going to love, then I said, I'm going to love militantly. I'm going to
mm,
love everybody. And I'm not going to hate anybody or, or condition my love for anybody on their nature being one that would be mine or one that even, I guess at the time I said would make sense to me.
mm-hmm,
Right. So it allowed me to move past wondering about that very quickly. And that has actually carried forward into other things where, I'm different. Um, But because of that, because Rastas generally came from a biblical tradition, there is an insane amount of homophobia. Um, and that's also very cultural, right? Like Jamaican culture is not very friendly to homosexuality.
Mm,
Um, but I do disagree with Rastas on that, on like where homosexuality matters, right? So that's something I've occasionally gotten into like arguments with people about. Um, because I just honestly I don't think it makes sense. A lot of the positions I know people are coming from, say that fundamentalist Christian type background, regardless. Even a lot of people who like recognize Rasta later in life were at some point a Christian.
mm.
And so it's not like we're going to get rid of all the history that we came through individually. And that's okay, I guess. But I don't think it's consistent to be all about love and then have something against somebody for simply loving like another person of the same gender. It's not my responsibility. It's not another race's responsibility to make sure somebody else is procreating, right? So
Yeah.
mind your business and love your neighbor.
Yeah. I mean, I'm of the mindset that like like you said, it doesn't even have to make sense to me, right? Like it doesn't even necessarily there are things in the world and ways that people live that make me uncomfortable, right? That who gives a shit? Like I mean it doesn't matter, right? One of the like the most liberating thought that I've ever had in my life was I don't even remember what the inciting thing was, but I was around a group of people and they were doing something that was making me uncomfortable and I got angry and then I realized why am I angry? And I had this moment where I was like this feeling of discomfort that's leading to anger and like the disgust impulse is probably what's at the root of a lot of the worst things in our world
Mm-hmm.
and the worst ways we treat people and fundamentally if everybody just was able to say I don't necessarily, not even like I tolerate it or like the whole love the sin or hate the sin thing. Like even that's too much for me. I'm just like, it doesn't make, I'm uncomfortable and it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like my personal hangups should not be an impediment to another human being who has the same suite of conscious experience and feelings and capacities for love and sorrow and everything else that I have, the way I feel should not impose upon them to live a worse life.
So I was talking to a Muslim brother actually about we're talking about this, and I said it for me. If I see a person here beside us, like his religious beliefs were that it was immoral for this gay person to be gay, I guess. And I said, but if this gay person is right there and they're helping their neighbors, they're taking care of like the neighborhood, they're looking out for everybody, they're nice, good person. How could you be against them because that thing, right? Like, what is more important, whether you think their existence is itself a sin or the person that they're living as, like how they're impacting the world? And we disagreed on it. I don't think he liked my conclusion, but I'm like, I would much more quickly call that gay person like brother than I would somebody who's a Rasta but who isn't trying to do something positive in the world, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's just how I view it. I viewed it. I think I viewed it that way in the latter years of me being a Christian as well, because I kind of grew up with this idea that we were uniquely good inside
Mhm.
the church. And then I think as I got older, I started realizing a lot of people outside the church were much better people, more moral people in my view, and lived more according to the morality I would have expected from inside the church. And so I came to realize it's not the stamp my religion gives or anyone else's religion gives of a person. It's who the person is and how they reflect out in the world. And that actually led to how my whole philosophy itself developed, sort of outside of all that as well.
Yeah. Um, which as you were talking, I was kind of thinking back to what you said initially about the foundational concept of like I and I within Rastafarianism, and that seems at odds with homophobia, right? Like,
It does. I I know. I get it. I understand them. I'm not. I think philosophically, it they cannot be homophobic if they follow through on the
mm,
philosophy. But at the same time, I recognize that people are generally coming from a fundamentalist Christian perspective,
mm.
and it's not as easy to let go of a lot of like where we how we were raised as we might want to think.
Yeah, that's fair. Um, I do find that that's true of pretty much any faith or religion or philosophy is very often. I mean, it's true of secular people too, right? Like especially in like the race realist, turfdom, like pick a reactionary movement, anything. People will start with their conclusion, and then they will use whatever framework they happen to exist within, be it humanism or religion or whatever, and they will or science, and they'll use it to get to the conclusion they started with, and that's not a condition that's exclusive to religion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that I guess maybe we can sort of wrap up with how is, because one of the things that kind of put us in contact with each other, and like how I came to follow you on Twitter, is you um just go absolutely fucking ham on like these race realist people, and in a way that I think is very, very productive. And I'm just wondering how did that become like a hobby horse for you online, just as a just in did
Hmm.
your beliefs influence that, or is it like a how'd you get to the point where you've become such a such a thorn in the side of these folks?
It's the weirdest thing because I don't. So okay, I really got interested in human genetics,
Mhm,
and I think I did it when I got on Twitter, really. And I would see like a paper here and there, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. So I'd go read a paper. Um, and then I kept reading more, and it is actually a really interesting area, which kind of ticks me off about these guys because
mhm,
they kind of don't make it seem like a really interesting area. So I actually would read a lot of it, and even what they're doing. So sometimes I'm actually more gracious to them than some people would be, where I think if they were sincere in their beliefs, they could actually keep going. So sometimes they'll reach some conclusion, and I say, okay, this is interesting. Go do some more work, and they're like, no, no, we're good here. Like essentially, that's what they're saying. Like we're good
mhm.
here because here where we are suggests something. It hints that something is real. But I'm like, yes, but as a scientist, you could go do that extra step, right? But they won't
Yeah,
do that extra step. They're leaving the inference for people to jump to their own conclusions just hanging. And so what
yeah,
I realized from talking to them though is they their arguments are actually just weak. Um, they operate at this level of superficiality that's just enough um, to seem convincing to a layperson, honestly. And then the people who I could tell could pick them apart are academics because the
mm,
mistakes they make, the sloppiness they exhibit, are things that going through, say, a grad program, you see very quickly. Like the methodological things they use and they try. We just knew you weren't supposed to do that. We knew we would fail a paper, we would fail an assignment if we did something like that. And in a weird way, it's actually backfired on the the academic community because they could see those flaws, they don't think these papers, these writings are worth even engaging because they look at it like, this is sloppy, I'm not going to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
And we think we win by saying we're not going to touch it. But the irony is, it doesn't matter for these people because they don't need us to be the audience. They know it is just enough to shift that layperson. And that's the goal. I have no pretense that, a lot of these scientific racists are actually trying to move forwards towards truth, regardless of what they tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Their actions belie that,
Yeah.
right? Like if they were, they would do certain things that they very clearly refuse to do, right? Um, but the actual academic community have sort of pulled ourselves or themselves. I guess I'm not an academic anymore. Pull themselves out of the conversation, and these guys run wild. And I've watched some actual like eminent scientists come in, and they kind of didn't even realize how much influence these communities, these racialist communities, were developing. Um, but when you get into it with them, and occasionally when you hit them with their own beliefs and then drive them forward, okay, let's take what you say is true and let's run with it,
Mm-hmm.
right? You end up in these places where either they don't understand it enough to go with you, and that's actually always been rather annoying, right? When I've said this is a natural consequence, and they could see it on the spot, but they've never actually thought it through. So they kind of do this song and dance with me.
Mm.
Or they have considered it, but it's not something that they want to say,
Do you
right? Like
can you
an
think of an
example.
example of that off the top of
Yeah,
your head?
there was I had one rather popular Twitter example where this was a paper that was retracted last year, I think, and it was using Richard Lynn, who fraud. He was a fraud, but he had a bunch of his IQ, national IQ, quote unquote, data in Africa, and this person used it in their paper and he was defending it after the paper was retracted. Um, and among it was a claim that said, the average IQ of Togo was 65. And I said, okay, let's run with that. So I said, by pretty much all of our standard understandings here, 70 is intellectually disabled, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
instead of the old word, right? The old R word.
Right.
Um, And I said, "So are you saying that more than half of this country is intellectually disabled?" And he's like, "No, no, no. I wouldn't use that word." I'm like, "Wait, why?" Like, we agree that in the U.S., for example, a lot of states, if your IQ is below 70, the government declares you're essentially a not functioning adult, and they will take care of you. So in Togo, you are saying more than half the people would qualify for that. So you're saying they're intellectually disabled. It's like, no, 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 I won't. I wouldn't use that. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, I know why he wouldn't use it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because he knows if he was to say on Twitter, I think, this country, which exists, has a functioning government, functioning civil society, and everything, more than half of them are, intellectually disabled, he would be laughed at. And he
Yeah.
had, aspirations of intellectual credibility, right? But
Right.
everyone would laugh at that on its face. And sometimes that's what I enjoy doing with these people
Mm-hmm.
is make them put the things that they actually believe that anyone who follows through on what they say could read and see, making them own up to it in public because I know politically they could tell sometimes it's too far. And I think the Nigerian one was another one that I I think a lot of them recognize was too far. So I think according to the same guy, the average IQ, the mean in Nigeria was 69, right? So
Mm-hmm.
similar. So more than half of Nigerians are intellectually disabled by this contention. But people in the US are used to Nigerians because they're used to Nigerian doctors and Nigerian professors and whatever. So I did the math on it. And if you do the math on it, by that, only 2% of Nigerians would be as smart as the average quote unquote white American,
Mm-hmm.
right? So 1 in 50. But if you were to
Yeah,
tell an American that,
that's obvious. Yeah, it's obviously ridiculous on its
they would
face.
they would laugh at you. And so like I want to force these people to own up to it, because then when normal people, the people that they would normally appeal to with just that level of superficiality, when they see what these lead to in terms of you must also believe this if you believe that, they'll quickly recognize that, okay, that's absurd. So it's
Hmm.
almost argument ad absurdum without
Hmm.
needing to do anything absurd. It's literally just taking what they say, take a deductive step and another deductive step, and say, okay, therefore you must also believe this. And most people are like, well, okay, well, that's too far. Like that's clearly a ridiculous thing to believe, right? So it's
Yeah,
I just find the entire project to be really intellectually shallow.
yeah,
And I find it's not actually that hard to show it. And I wish, like, I'm not a geneticist, obviously. I wish more geneticists would take the time. They find a lot of these guys not worth their time, which is fair. But as we saw with like the Buffalo shooting, for example, it doesn't matter if other academics think these guys are credible. What matters is that there's going to be some 18-year-old kid who's going to think, yeah, this makes sense. I'm going to go shoot people because of these eugenicists.
yeah, yeah. There's that is a problem that I personally wrestle with this, which is this is sort of orbits the concept of do we or do we not debate fascists, right? That whole thing, and I think that I'm of the mind that if somebody is openly spouting just the most crass and naked kind of bigotry, that it's not worth engaging with them because you're you are lending legitimacy to them just by engagement. But if somebody is in that middle space where they're where they're pretending at legitimacy, like a lot of these race IQ folks do, that it does, like you say, merit um, academic and like institutional response. Because if it doesn't receive that, like you say, they get to sort of just go around talking without any response and present themselves as legitimate authorities on subjects for which you know
They have no legitimate authority.
yeah, yeah, and it does. Yeah, I think that I think when it's in the realm of the academy or people who would pretend to be in the academy, that it merits a very vicious response. I don't actually think that academia should be apolitical, right? I think that if you're out there spouting race science, then the genetic the genetic community has an obligation to say, actually, this is all bullshit, and here's why. And I get that that's exhausting, but
Yeah, I 100% agree. I would not tell any academic to debate them. And honestly, I don't even tell myself that I debate them, right? So if,
mhm,
if I'm invited, say, on a podcast to talk to one of them, I will not go, because it's weird. I don't believe they're credible enough for that kind of a conversation,
right,
right? It's very interesting because sometimes that seems counter to how I interact on Twitter, but my interaction on Twitter is never actually a debate with these
mm,
people, right? I'm not even really talking to them, if you will.
mhm,
I'm talking through them,
mhm,
right? I'm speaking to others to show who these people are. Like I don't. I think I sometimes appear like I grant them more credibility even than I do, um,
yeah,
but I don't. And I think what you're talking about, the academy and their response, there was one really famous case. I mentioned it on Twitter about Joseph L. Graves. He's an evolutionary biologist. And Nicholas Wade, who's like a New York Times science writer, had written a book about race realism and like scientific racism, really. And he cited a bunch of like geneticists and stuff. And Graves led an initiative and got an open letter written by pretty much everybody he cited, and a bunch more, just publicly calling him out, saying like, "This is BS. This is not what our work says. This is garbage." Essentially,
mhm,
And I think that's what the academy should do. Like, I believe in academic freedom, especially if you're tenured. Actually, only if you're tenured, really, in my view. If you're tenured, say what you want, and there should be nothing that follows. But I do believe there is a responsibility, a moral one, a scientific one, an ethical one, on the academy writ large, so including that person's university, to make clear what they're saying is BS
Mm,
and to demonstrate or unacceptable morally or otherwise. Like, I think it's very, sometimes on free speech people will say, like, you should just let people say what they want, and I think that's insane. um, Let people say what they want, sure, but then if your response to them saying something that you find morally objectionable is silence, that's complicity. That's not doing
yeah.
nothing. You're doing something. You're just actually also doing a bad thing. So I think, like, Rushton was at a university when he spoke out and he said his garbage. I think there was a moral responsibility on the university to say this is garbage, and I think they failed that. So the university deserves criticism, and any of these institutions, what, like University of Pennsylvania, I think it is, with Amy Wax, right?
Mm,
She has the right, she has tenure to say the crap she wants, but they have a responsibility to make it very clear that they do not stand with her at all. And in fact, almost every time she says something stupid like that, they should turn around and start a new diversity initiative. just to
yeah.
just to get them. Yeah, you keep wanting to say racist stuff. Sure, all right, we'll keep helping minorities. Maybe just, but
What
I
a
think that would silence them a good bit, right? Every time you say
Yeah.
something stupid, we'll create another $1 million scholarship for black kids.
I I I do like that. I do wonder at the we're at a point now where the the right, like the far right, and increasingly just the right, and is so I look at you, so you say that the academy, and I think we both agree the academy should respond to bullshit claims by calling them bullshit and doing very rigorous work to debunk these pseudoscientific claims that are being made with airs of legitimacy. But there is a very prominent example of that being done currently with regard to gender studies, right? Like they're the social sciences have largely pushed back very hard on right wing narratives of gender essentialism. And the response has been to just undermine the entire academic discipline, right? The through line now on the right is, well, we can't even trust our institutions anymore because they've been, epistemically captured. And so I wonder what would happen if that happened in like the quote unquote hard sciences like evolutionary biology and what have you. Because I think that I think the social sciences are a little easier to attack, but I wonder at what point have we got, like, I wonder if they'd just be able to completely delegitimize the academy in its entirety.
I think they have, but I don't
Yeah.
think it matters, right? Okay,
Yeah.
so these people will say the academy is captured, blah blah
Hmm.
blah.
Yeah.
Who cares? It's the same. It's the same as like the numbers. Like, okay, academics are 90x% left wing. Okay, who cares? Why do we care that they find that a problem? Does the academy stop doing what it does? Do we stop producing research? Do we stop advancing knowledge? No. So why, it's not our responsibility to particularly care about these people's political claims about capture or whatnot. We're still, if you're still doing the work, it doesn't matter that these guys are out there. They're not the mainstream. They're
Yeah.
not the ones that really matter that much. They're a bunch of crybabies at this point, right? So yes, they can't win in the marketplace of ideas, so they declare that the marketplace, is invalid, right?
Mhm.
Like, okay. I don't find I find these complaints from people who are then it doesn't matter. Do they matter in terms of like their cries, right? I've often made this call. I think science works in a very interesting way, including social science, right? Anybody could jump into it. So I keep saying if the right has all these complaints that all the scientists are turning left wing, okay, let me see the right wing scientists. Let's see what they could produce, right?
Hmm.
And if all they're producing is stuff that we'll look at and it's fringe stuff, okay, well, I'm just going to laugh at it and say, well, I've had that conversation at least on the race front with people where their citations are people like ML Kierkegaard, who I don't even think has any real scientific education. And I'm like, yay, that's cool. That's cool. Here's like, and I'll show them the citations from somebody who might be like, world recognized evolutionary biologist versus their random dude with a blog. I'm like, is this really a fair argument? Like, do you think you have standing here? And I think this is the same, even on the social science front. Almost any professor, all these professors in the humanities, why would they or why should they grant standing to a Matt Walsh or whoever? Who cares what a person like that thinks? Who cares how they want to debate? Like I saw this recently. I think it was yesterday. So I'm going to use the name Jason Stanley, the philosopher.
Hmm.
Um, the topic came up about what was it? He was asking. He was joking. So it was about the whole defined woman thing. And
Right.
honestly, by being on Twitter, I've hung out with too many philosophers, so I kind of get what they're for now and how complicated their lives must be. And he asked for. He said, "There's no very clear and easy way to define dessert plate, right?" Which
Yeah.
for a normal person, like I'm a normal person, I'm like, well, it's a dessert plate. That shouldn't be hard. Um, but then I realized it is kind of hard. And if you've been on like Aaron's show, uh, you realize like in his like lightning round, a lot of things aren't that clear cut. And somebody was trying to come up with like this very flippant description of dessert plate. And all I could immediately start thinking is, there are so many holes in that. Like so many ways this doesn't quite work. And I kind of came to realize, Jason's kind of right. But all these people
Yeah.
are there like dunking. Oh, they're dunking on him. Like, haha, stupid philosopher can't, define dessert plate. And I'm like, but you guys are idiots, right? Like, and that's all I was seeing is like you're idiots pretending at like you know intellect, right?
Yeah.
And in that moment, I kind of realized, okay, you know what? Sometimes we grant too much credibility to these actors, making claims about the academy, how the academy's captured and the academy's blah blah blah. But of when you talk to these people, I don't know. Maybe it's I just don't look at what they're saying as somehow meaningful in comparison, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of them because, as you know, I interact with a lot of, say, like centrists, if you will. And
Hmm.
sometimes they'll make their points, and they sometimes see themselves as so bright and insightful, and their fans are like, "Yeah, you're right, you get them." And I just look at them like that is just not smart. like I
Yeah.
get it, your fans will applaud, but it's not an equal fight, I guess, as well. So
Yeah. I mean the entirety of the right at this point is basically just you know the pole board from 4chan in the early aughts. It's just a wasteland of shit memes and people dunking on each other and they don't even care if they're right.
how to put it? I think assuming all these conversations are on the same level is kind of a fool's errand.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even make sense. I guess this is a political question, like what to do
Hmm.
when you okay. So put it that. What do you do when you have scientific knowledge on your side, even social understanding, let's say, on your side, um, and you're dealing with people that reject that? Um, I don't think you could set your goal to be to constantly argue with them or even pull them towards you. And
Hmm.
maybe that's just my overall philosophy at this point in my life is it's not to convince people that completely disagree with me. It's to convince people that are reachable, right? you don't need all of them to see. And honestly, even on it's a lot of these battles aren't even supposed to be for academics, generally speaking, right? Some of them are. Um, but what an academic even has an understanding of isn't really for the everyday person, sadly. And I know some people don't necessarily like to hear that. There is supposed to be a layer in between the academy and those who are talking normal everyday talk.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's an activist, but it's normal people of some sort, right? So a normal person who has a different view of um, a gender that's closer to, say, the views that an academic might present, it's more on them to talk to the average person, right? Like honestly, that professor, I got what he was saying. I wouldn't put him in front of my mother, right? Like my evangelical mother. Good luck with that, right? Like
Yeah,
it's just not meant to be the audience. And I think
right.
sometimes this is a criticism I'll have of the social sciences and how they differ than the other ones. It's that because it's social, they're often the ones pulled into conversations with normal people.
Mhm.
And I think like somebody you put throw somebody with a physicist, the person like, well, I'm not gonna understand anything this person says, and they've already like went into it with that. But if you're like, okay, we're gonna talk about gender, they're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. Let's do it, right? And so they're going toe to toe. But an academic isn't really equipped for that conversation because it's
Yeah.
talking at a different to a it's at a not a different level, it's a different dimension, I suppose. Um, but there should be people there, though, who can have those conversations about why gender isn't this essentialist concept, or why. Like, actually, I've found I need someone to explain what a social construct is to normal person people.
Yeah. I
Um,
actually like Jason Stanley's dessert plate thing for that specifically because the only coherent definition for what is a dessert plate is a plate that follows dinner, and then you have to ask the question, well, what is dinner? And it's like, well, by demonstrating that, you're demonstrating that it is actually a thing that we construct
oh, wait a minute.
socially.
That's you said a plate that follows dinner, but when I
Yeah.
was thinking of dessert plate, when I was thinking of it, I was thinking about as an object,
Oh,
like the
okay.
plate itself. See, so even there,
Yeah.
how do we define? Because both uses are correct. Like what
Yeah.
you said,
Yeah.
there's perfect. I didn't even consider that one. So whatever definition we come up with dessert plate must be able to accommodate both, which is kind
Yeah.
of illogical.
I think that might be the sticking point is that the because earlier too I had this thought when you were talking about IQ in Africa and the studies where so many people were found to be below the mean, or like the mean was you know going to be intellectually disabled. And my thought was, well, let's presume that those numbers are actually correct. And the 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 takeaway that I would have from that is, well, that just means that the way we measure IQ is worthless.
Oh, you want to hear
Yeah,
a funny story about that? So yes, I agree with that.
yeah,
So Jensen, who's pretty much like the intellectual father of a lot of these hereditarians today, um, he while he was studying, he realized something. He said, "Okay, a lot of these white children with IQs below 70." When I look at them, there's clearly something wrong with them, like how they look, how they act. They just look off. He's like, but these black children whose IQs are below 70, they look normal. They carry
mhm.
themselves like normally. They don't seem to have anything wrong with them. And so, that there's that meme where like, go on, like you're this close. And he's like, it must be because black people adapted to being intellectually disabled differently. And I was like, what? Like you were
Oh,
so
Jesus
close to like
fucking Christ.
that I posted about that one because that one blew my mind that was his conclusion was that we're just black people are just better adapted at being mentally disabled, that's why they look normal even when their IQ is below 70. And I was like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
God
It,
damn. but yeah, like the when you have like cleavage points like that, right, where you can break one way or the other, and one way is clearly nonsensical, and but the other requires you to commit to a certain level of like squidginess or fuzziness about the way we understand the world. Um, Very often, the the response to that from like reactionaries will be, well, if you're is that this conclusion is obviously false because it's in some way nebulous or it undermines a
Mhm.
way that we understand the world. And I don't actually know how to combat that because I think that there's some number of the population
Yeah.
who strives toward a very clear, like almost platonic understanding of the world. And then there's another group who are just comfortable with things being a little fuzzy in some places. And that whichever way you break might make you more or less susceptible to this kind of reactionary pipeline stuff.
Which is why you do need separate classes, even on, say, the left, if we're going to do a left right dichotomy here.
Mhm.
Um, it isn't an academic. An academic is about that fuzziness. That's the nature of the job. There's very few simple things that are that clear cut. But politicians, on the other hand,
Mhm.
they have to exist outside of the academy. And yeah, sad to say, it is a politician's job to go with the simple because the simple does work, right? Politically
Mhm.
speaking, simple is true. That's not true, but that works for people, right? Something sounds simple, sounds straightforward, it's true, right?
Yeah.
So for a politician, they could take what they want from the academy, take the truth, um, but they do have to find some way to make it simple and make it work, right? And even if that means losing, essentially, or not losing, disagreeing with the academics, disagreeing with what they themselves accept to be true, but then phrasing it in a way that politically still gets you there. And I think it's a tough thing to deal with. So I'll give you one person I'll shout out. So Matt Iglesias is kind of a funny person because I've seen a lot of the times people get mad at his tweets, and I disagree with his tweets quite a good amount. But politically, I get it, right? Matt's job is Matt wants the left to win, period, and that means Matt will jettison anybody who he thinks is a risk to the left winning. And I've seen it tick off some of like my black friends because sometimes Matt will straight up jettison black people, right? Or black concerns or black issues because he thinks, you know what? Yep, this will not sell well. And sometimes I actually think that makes sense. That approach makes sense for a politician. Some issues, jettison them, but go towards the destination. So even in that one with Matt, like he was like, sometimes you throw out some of the issues that might get that black people might be talking about, but then when you win, you do something for black people, right? Or you flip that issue and you talk about something that might benefit black people, and if you're not going to say it directly because you know how that will play as well, right? And I think that approach is actually where politics should be, honestly. Again, I don't like being on the side where Matt would say like screw people like that, but at the same time, overall, if the side wins, you will gain. So even on gender stuff, sometimes I think politicians and racial stuff even politicians should take a whole step back, let that debate happen in the public sphere, let academics and lay people fight it out, play politics, and sometimes playing politics means disagreeing with sometimes things that you believe to be fundamentally true, and then making something simple that works, right? I don't think we always need to say, like, we're going to do this for equity, for example. Like, we're going to do policy X for equity because we know how that will play. We're going to do policy X because it's a good idea. And we all know behind the scenes, like, hey, that'll be good for equity. Good. Just don't say it, right? You don't need to say,
I've come up with a term for the because I spend a lot of time in like fairly radical like left wing spaces, and I also like spend some time in like the more like academic lefty spaces, and then like some like your demsoc like not even like centrist but more progressive like places, and like all these people hate each other. And
True.
I've come up with a term that I like to deploy, and it's called mutually antagonistic solidarity. And I think that there is this thing that happens where if you do it just right, you have all these forces who largely agree with the direction society should go, but absolutely disagree over the methodology of how to get there in
True.
terms of like tactics, and to the extent that they don't associate with one another.
Mhm.
But I think that if each individual group does what they're going to do anyway very well, that can push you towards progress.
Agreed.
Like, I would never ask somebody who is, like doing setting up like an anarchist mutual aid tent or something to go canvas for Bernie, right? Like, nor would I ask like a Bernie canvasser to, um, you know, get dress in black bloc or something, right? Like
Mm.
those are different people, and they're going to
Yep.
gravitate towards different things, and they're by their very nature going to be actively antagonistic towards each other. So that honestly, like, sort of the whole point of this show that I do in some respects is to put different versions of those people in front of other people and just be like, pick whichever one's going to work for you, but just go fucking do something.
Yep. Mhm.
Like,
Yep.
whatever you're inclined to do, go do it. And then if enough people just do something, maybe we'll get somewhere. That's
Agreed.
so like it's sort of like a weird, vicious standoff ish pragmatism. I don't know. I've never really put it in words before, but that's kind of, I think it meshes a little bit with what you just said.
Yep. I like that. A whole bunch of my philosophy is more about like social dynamics, like let things play out socially. You find your common points, you push on them, and then you'll push the needle far enough that you'll win something, right? And at the end of the day, it's at least on stuff like this, the rhetoric matters very little to me. Um, and it's weird to say, yes, I will react to the rhetoric. We all will. But at the end of the day, the rhetoric doesn't matter that much. It is the policies that matter, right? So I see the same reactionaries, and we're all now, what is it, groomer time now? That's the thing now, groomer. Um, these people are going to push, and we have to be, at least the left, or not insane people, I should say, have to be careful, right? Um, because weirdly, by engaging in this debate with them, we legitimize their debate, right? Um, and I'll be honest, like, I'm trans affirming, so everyone knows that, or I try to say that, but like when politicians on the left getting to debates with the right on what is a woman, that is it's a losing cause. Just stay out of it. It's not your business as a politician to be in that discussion, right? Just say whatever. Uh, say whatever you know is the easiest politically, right? Let the activists fight that one out in public, right? And then when you win, you protect trans people. Like that to me is the what counts, right? Like honestly, you see it, and I'll see a politician or a person I like say, I don't know. And I get what they're doing. I get the political urge to even say, I don't know. And I wouldn't tell them to go for the academic answer either. Just say what's easy. Go for what's politically expedient. And I think outside in the public, activists or normal people, well, no, activists have to recognize that a politician's job is not to be an activist, it's to be a politician. Right. So they're supposed to tick you off. If you're a proper activist, you should not like politicians, even the ones on your side, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
maybe that's something that's changed over the years, for example, because I know too many people are like too on board with their politicians now, and that's very weird to me.
Yeah.
Like, And maybe that's a Rasta thing, because Rastas have never actually been that into politicians. Um, we've always sort of been anti-politician, right?
Mhm.
So it's just very interesting to me that the modern generation expects the politician to be the person who's marching beside them, at the protest, which is it's not their job.
Yeah, and, like, conversely, like, I've seen, like, and I think this was a big problem during, like, the uprisings a couple years ago, was, you can go back and watch all those, like, the video clips, and you can pretty much tell, like, "Oh, this person's doing this for political clout,"
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like, I've come to firmly believe that there is nothing more corrosive and dangerous to an activist movement than an ambitious 20-something with a megaphone.
Ouch. Ouch.
Like,
Poor.
yeah, like, it just it's bad. Like,
Yeah.
not all of them, right? Like, some people out there, like, who were doing that, like, were legit and, like, really wanted to do the thing, but a vast majority of those folks, you could tell, were just like, "This is gonna be in my campaign, role one day."
I hope so. I think it's the. I don't. I'm gonna be fair to them. I think a
Yeah.
lot of them step out there with the most sincere of intentions,
Yeah.
but then when acceptance from people in power positions of power, political power itself, um, or that attention in general comes knocking, money, capital comes knocking.
Mhm.
I think we would be expecting too much for the average person to resist, right? Like,
Yeah.
depending, like, let's say your principles are really true, and you grew up poor, and somebody comes and says, "I'll give you $1 million if all you have to do is, just drink my soda in an ad."
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I think it's a lot to ask that person not to, or think like their moral principles are so deep that they're gonna say no. Because I would get it if they said
Yeah.
yes. Like, you've seen the joke that a lot of black people on Twitter will joke that, man, I wish I could put my morality aside for a minute and jump on the grift of,
Yeah.
just selling out and just saying, like, yeah, it's all those black people are all screwed up. Now give me some money.
Yeah, grab some of Candace O's bag.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
for the right amount of money, how many people? I'll put it this way: for $1 million, how many leftists, if $1 million was put in front of them, would refuse to be Candace Owens or a
yeah,
personality like hers for $1 million, cash in hand? I think I love a lot of people, but a lot of people would sell out.
yeah,
That's
which I
understandable.
it's yeah, totally understandable, and ironically is probably one of the greatest defenses of why the leftists are right about how we should fix society is because $1 million in an ideal world wouldn't be an effective motivator because you
Yeah,
wouldn't need it.
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, yeah,
But I think that's what happened to a lot of the
yeah, yeah,
activists.
for
So
sure.
I don't think I don't hold that, like, even the BLM people who yeah, they sold out. Um, that's a lot of money to throw in front of people who, from their lives, they weren't rich people growing up, right? So
Yeah,
this is life changing money. So okay, they sold out. So I don't know. I think I wouldn't say get yourself tied to any activist anyway, right?
yeah,
Because yeah, they might sell out on you. Tie yourselves to your principles and what you stand for. Let politicians be themselves, and let activists be themselves. See where the chips fall.
yeah. That's sound advice, and that's probably a good spot to end it on because I know we're coming up on time. So, uh, Mansa Keita, thank you so much for joining me. Do you have any pluggables you want to plug or anything you
No,
want
I
to?
plug nothing. um,
Okay,
just love uh, love your neighbor. Be good to each other, and let's try to make this world a better place.
absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, sir.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards again. I just want to thank you for watching or listening, however you get this content. I really appreciate it. You may have noticed there have been some changes. I moved the office around. I'm presently in the process of building out a more dope gamer-esque backdrop. that I hope will be complete the next time I do one of these. If you've been following me on Twitch, which I've been gaming a little more recently, you'll have noticed the progress. And the other big change is that the website no longer exists. I had to renew it, or it came up for renew, and it was like $500 for hosting, and I just couldn't justify the cost. To my knowledge, nobody even went there. It was just kind of a placeholder because I feel like you're supposed to have a website, but the Gmail or the email is through Google, and all of my stuff is hosted on Libsyn, through podcast catchers and on YouTube. So I don't really feel like the website was doing anything for me. But if you really like the website, if you got some utility out of it, then you can help bring it back by subscribing to my Patreon, or giving me a one-time tip via Venmo, Coffee, PayPal. And if we get enough of those, maybe the .com will come back at some point. Or maybe I'll take that money and use it to, pay for something else productive on the show. But I would like this to be a break-even effort, and any little financial help that you can provide would be productive towards that, and I'd really appreciate it. If you don't want to support the show financially, if you can't, totally get it. I understand. It's not something everybody can do, and that's totally fine. But you can still support the show. You can like and subscribe to me on all of your podcasting apps, on YouTube. You can hit the little bell thing to get a notification, because the algorithm doesn't really like me for some reason. So that's helpful if you want to get reminded of my content, and comment on the YouTube pages. That helps boost me in the algorithm. And just share all the stuff with your friends and family, and pester them on the social media and the Tweety spaces and what have you. I'm on social media everywhere at Ultraviolet Pod. Twitter. I don't have a Facebook anymore. It just is a cesspool, and I just don't have one anymore. Fuck that website. And Instagram, occasionally I'll post pictures of my cat, and then you can find me on Twitch at UVPod. And that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.